Well, I would like to say good afternoon to all of my friends and colleagues. It's wonderful to see you all assembled here after a 2-year hiatus. I would like to thank very much our Greek hosts for putting on such a wonderful occasion, particularly last night and the reception on board the battleship. We're just almost over the top. And the purpose of today's meeting is we've devoted a whole session to our 2 most recent Corbusier Prize winners. Our president and our vice president gave some details about the prize. I would like to add just a couple of words about the genesis of the Corbusier Prize, which was done on the initiative of our president, Massimo de Leonardis, with, I think, the enthusiastic support of the executive board and the full board. And it bears a award prize of 3,000 euros and another 1,500 euros travel money to come and deliver a paper here to the annual meeting. And I would like to give you just a brief overview of the prizes, the winners, and the topics as they have been given out over the last 5 years. Because it's kind of interesting, it reflects the true international character of our organization, both in terms of the prize winners, their nationalities and national commissions, but also the subject matter and the universities they attended. The prize was really created as a result of an annual meeting we had in 2016, and the first prize went in 2017 to Dr. Caleb Carge from Christ College, Cambridge. The title of the thesis was "So Perverse an Ally, Great Britain's Alliance with Austria in the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. And then in 2018, we moved on to a wholly different subject. Dr. Maxime Petitjean from the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, submitted a dissertation on mounted cavalry combat in the Roman Empire from the 1st through the 6th century AD. Thereafter, Dr. Adam Lindsay Storing, who's here with us today from St. John's College, Cambridge, submitted a prize-winning dissertation on Frederick the Great and the meanings of war from 1730 to 1755. And we have with us today 2 very distinguished young men who wrote what I think are brilliant theses. One of my last acts as vice president of this organization was to participate in deliberations that resulted in the award going to Dr. Marcel Berny, who is Swiss, did his bachelor's and master's degree at the University of Bern, and his PhD at the University of Hamburg. The title of his thesis was "Germany Out of Action, Life, Suffering, and Death of Communist Prisoners in Vietnam's American War." Now, for this year's prize award, which I did not participate, though I did have the good fortune to read the thesis, which was forwarded to me by our Secretary General, Chris Quanton, and thank you, Chris, was to Dr. Paul Berenger, who did a bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin. He, like myself, hails from the great state of Wisconsin. He went on to do a master's degree at the University of Chicago, and then his PhD from American University in Washington, D.C. And the topic of his thesis, the title I should say, is U.S. and Japanese Intervention in the Russian Civil War, Violence and Barbarism in the Far East. So I'm not going to take up more of our speakers' time with introductions. My speakers have asked me not to go on at any great length. So first, Dr. Barney would like to deliver his presentation, which I'm sure you are all going to find very, very interesting. So Dr. Barney, the floor is yours.
Dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, caro professore de Leonardis, thank you very much for this prize. It is a great pleasure to be in Athens today, and I would like to thank for the invitation and also the organization of this wonderful conference. But let's start. From January 31st to February 2nd, 1971, over 100 American Vietnam veterans and 16 civilians gathered at Howard Johnson Center Motor Inn in Detroit, Michigan to testify about the war crimes they had observed in South Vietnam. Among them were enlisted soldiers and officers from every service branch of the US military who had traveled from across the country to the Wolverine State to disclose for the first time atrocities committed in Southeast Asia. With the contemporaneous trial at Fort Benning of 2nd Lieutenant William Laws Kelly, who faced trial for the My Lai massacre, 1971 had thus become the annus horribilis for the leadership of the American armed forces. But the Kelly trial and the gathering of the so-called winter soldiers in Michigan were more than just a portent. The trust of broad sections of the American population in the established military and civilian institutions had already begun to crumble in 1971. Among those testifying in Detroit was a 27-year-old captain of the 1st Marine Division, who had served as a helicopter pilot in northern South Vietnam from August 1966 to September 1967, flying 725 combat missions. In order to increase the credibility of his statements, Ernest Sachs, the name of the pilot in question, had even agreed that his descriptions could be filmed. With this short, but in my opinion, very concise film excerpt, I would like to go straight into medias res. However, there are 3 passages in the movie that seem incomprehensible to the non-Vietnam experts amongst you, so here's a brief explanation. When Sachs refers to Cong or VC in the following, he means the Viet Cong, the guerrillas who fought in South Vietnam to overthrow the regime in Saigon. In contrast, Sachs understands NVA as the regular North Vietnamese army which used North Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia as staging areas to fight against the United States and its allies. Last but not least, the abbreviation VCS is dropped in the film clip, referring to the so-called Viet Cong suspects, meaning suspected civilian fighters or supporters of the Viet Cong. And I would be grateful if we could play the movie now.
Yeah. 66, September 67.
Have you ever witnessed any of the following? One, prisoner shot.
I don't know whether I have or not, offhand.
This one might be apropos. Prisoners thrown from helicopters.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've never seen them thrown out of my airplane because it's behind me, but we had a couple of guys from Philadelphia in our squadron who used to blindfold the guys with safety wire and pull them real tight, so this copper wire is tearing into their eyes and nose, and bind their hands with safety wire. And used to have contests seeing how far they could throw the bound bodies out of the airplane. And, you know, throw one as far as you can and see if you can get the other one farther.
If you could approximate how many instances have you come across this?
Of that, in the two-digit numbers, say, somewhere between 15 and 50, probably.
And some of these people weren't necessarily either COM or NVA. Some could be VCS.
You never know.
Yeah.
You never know. If they're alive, they're VCS automatically. If they're dead, then they're confirmed VC.
Did you ever, were you ever issued orders on not taking prisoners or disposing?
We were told, do not count prisoners when you're loading them on board the aircraft. Count them when you unload them. Which the naive young brown bar says, well, why? What difference does it make? And the wizened old first lieutenant says, because the numbers may not jive. And sure enough, you don't count them when they're getting on, because there was a little bit of a feeling here. The guy who told me this was a captain. And he said, don't ever count them when they go aboard, because presumably you'd have to say something if one of them got thrown out.
Give your name, what unit you were in, and
So how do we interpret and contextualize such horrible statements? Certainly we have to be critical in classifying such sources. For many self-testimonies about war crimes against communist prisoners in South Vietnam come along in a similar dress. It would not be far off to speak of a narrative transfer in many accounts of experiences. After all, these are often acts that are reported secondhand and have been popularized in the context of the anti-war movement. Thus, Sachs also says at the beginning of his testimony that we just heard that he cannot remember whether his comrades shot enemy prisoners of war. Thereupon, the interviewer jumps ahead without comment to head for the real question, the one about pushing prisoners out of American transport helicopters. Again, Sachs evades the question at first. Vietnamese prisoners were not thrown out of his helicopter, but he knows of soldiers from Philadelphia who regularly tied up prisoners in order to push them out of flying helicopters. There were even competitions to see who could throw prisoners the farthest. When asked whether this was a common practice, the strangely smiling veteran replies that in his unit prisoners were thrown out of helicopters between 15 and 50 times. What was known among American and South Vietnamese soldiers as the so-called long step, flying lessons, half a chopper ride, or air interrogation corresponded to a procedure extremely feared among prisoners, which can be traced in source collections and archival files. But what were the enabling conditions for such and similar atrocities that sound so horrific? How did the perpetrators justify themselves afterwards? In what form did surviving victims report? Undoubtedly, not all communist prisoners were tortured, abused, raped, or murdered. And yet, in the comparative analysis of their treatment, the excess of violence in the field as well as in the rear stands out. So for the next 20 minutes, we trace the treatment of such communist prisoners in Vietnam's American War through 3 selected findings. First, I would venture the thesis that contemporary classifications and categorizations of prisoners reveal much more about the motives of the classifiers than about the prisoners themselves. Contemporary terms are rarely trustworthy. Rather, they are instrumentalizations of bogus unambiguities imposed by a bureaucratic machine in order to satisfy record-keeping institutions. Take, for example, the official number of communist prisoners of war in the Vietnam War in 1972, 37,451. Yet, during the same period, some 200 to 300,000 additional civilian prisoners, so-called civil defendants, were held in South Vietnam. Although these prisoners were not legally considered prisoners of war, it seems illogical to argue that they would have been in captivity even if there had not been a war. Therefore, it is tantamount to a methodological cardinal error if historians merely limit themselves to contemporary classifications and, for example, only focus on the fate of prisoners of war. Rather, it seems more fruitful to pursue a more integrative approach, and in particular to take into account the agenda of the classifiers. At first glance, this may seem counterintuitive. Often, established categories would offer an easier way to study and distinguish different types of prisoners. However, the reluctance of American and South Vietnamese actors to categorize prisoners as prisoners of war had a specific twist. Civilian prisoners did not, in fact, enjoy the broad rights codified by the international community in the Third Geneva Convention. Civil defendants merely had to be treated humanely under international law, and what humane meant was disputed and open to interpretation. Consequently, that very category of civilian prisoner was abused. Journalist Orville Schell wrote in this regard in 1968, I quote, "Civil defendant is the vaguest and most poorly defined of the categories. Officially, someone who is suspected of being a spy, saboteur, or terrorist comes under this category. But actually, it is a convenient designation for anyone about whom the interrogation teams cannot make up their minds. These unfortunates fall into a limbo category." Schell's observation is an interesting one that we must check with other sources. And it is precisely among soldiers and civilian guards that similar descriptions appear over and over again. Interrogation specialist Peter N. Martinson put it in the following formula, quote, "Any person can be placed in the category of a civil defendant. It is a catch-all," unquote. And Ernest Sachs had pointed out a similar dilemma in the video shown at the beginning. I quote, you never know whether these prisoners are Viet Cong. If they are alive, they're VC automatically. If they're dead, they're confirmed VC," unquote. This arbitrariness had also affected the count. For Sachs, this meant the following, quote, "Do henceforth not count prisoners when you're loading them on the aircraft, count them when you unload them, because the numbers may not jibe," unquote. In other words, count only the surviving prisoners. Any divergence between capture and delivery could lead to critical inquiries. The associated moral self-aggrandizement and the de facto introduction of a special enemy penal code were documented manifold by soldiers, civilian intelligence officers, and journalists. To quote the journalist Schell again, enemy prisoners were, quote, "guilty until proven innocent," unquote. This brings me to my second finding. Both on the battlefield and in the rear, social practice and the informal unit climate were more powerful than the theoretical law of war. The law of war and the self-obligations derived from it were unequivocal for American, South Vietnamese, and Allied troops. All military legal decrees drafted by the US High Command categorically prohibited the use of force against prisoners as defined by international law. In practice, however, the spectrum of everyday interpersonal violence ranged from simple harassment to abuse, torture, murder, and rape, from simple hair pulling to ejection from helicopters. Explaining such a flood of violence against prisoners is complex, and it seems to me that we need to look in particular at the informal lift practice, the so-called command culture, and the standing operating procedure derived from it. This was, in contrast to the law of war, nowhere written down and categorized by a strong situational and subjective perception of war. A GI from the 4th Infantry Division expressed precisely this divergence between theory and practice and the accentuating culture of violence in his unit as follows. I quote, "To hell with DoD directives. Neither as an individual nor as part of a group was I ever told, either by NCOs, platoon leaders, or any other officers, not to kill civilians in Vietnam. On the contrary," unquote. If in addition an armed force begins to measure the progress of the war by the numbers of enemies killed, this also affects the way it deals with prisoners and its tolerance of violence against non-combatives. American soldiers in particular were unprepared for war and increasingly frustrated by the invisibility of the real enemy as well as in need of revenge. Hence, they started to look for substitute enemies, and these were prisoners, suspects, and others in need of protection. No matter whether we look at American or South Vietnamese sources, they suggest a very similar conclusion. In order to show any kind of success, a seemingly endless hunt for prisoners became the sine qua non of this war. Those who speak of a war of attrition, of search and destroy, of body count and kill ratio, must not be surprised if the subordinate troops take such bellicose demands as a free pass for unbridled violence. Quote, "In the beginning we turned the prisoners over, but it was kind of hard after you had been there a while and you started seeing, learning, finding out what real experience is all about. It's like being in a football team where you have to follow the rules to the letter and the other team can do whatever the hell they like." The voices of authority in the company, the platoon sergeants and officers, acknowledged that executing prisoners was a proper way to behave. We supported it, unquote. In this respect, violence was destructive only for the victims, but for the perpetrators, it was a transformative social act directed at internal and external addressees. According to my reading, it is precisely this exemplary violence that is to be understood as an integrative part of the brutalization of the Second Indochina War. This forbidden interpersonal violence against communist prisoners created a psychological dissonance which the perpetrators tried to suppress via self-deception. For it was clear to both perpetrators and victims that violence against prisoners was not legal. To quote Sachs again, presumably you'd have to say something if one of them got thrown out of your helicopter. Because no prisoners were pushed out of his helicopter, Sachs said he consequently never filed any charges, even though this practice was nothing less than standard operating procedure in other units. Like Sachs, many perpetrators instigated a personal ex post narrative to excuse their actions and justify themselves. Although we are reaching the limits of our discipline here, such accounts of experiences are psychologically highly interesting. What is certain is that they were often accompanied by a de-evolution of victims without identity. From the perspective of the perpetrators, for example, they were only communists or only Asians. Against the background of this racist self-delusions, it simply did not matter how reckless they were treated. In this respect, one concept was overused in Vietnam and thus became an apparent, all-legitimizing pretext for violence against non-combatants, that of military necessity. From the tacit acceptance of torture as a seemingly legitimate means of intelligence gathering to witness testimony and lawyers' plea before court-martial, recourse to military necessity seemed to excuse even the most vicious excesses of violence. Specialist 4 Robert Sanders, like so many of his comrades, sought to excuse his own self-radicalization. Quote, "If Charlie can do it, we are going to do the same thing to him. Charlie turned you into animal," unquote. The soldier in this question is not talking about the enemy, but simply about Charlie. Such exculpatory statements serve to shift the blame onto the enemy. Ultimately, however, each soldier was master of his own actions. Consequently, it was not Charlie who turned Sanders into an animal, but the perception of the individual war constellation that allowed the perpetrator to report on a specific combat situation in an apologetic manner. Similar apologies have been swallowed by military lawyers and judges. For example, in the case of a gang rape of a prisoner by a platoon of Marines. Although convicted in the first trial, all perpetrators benefited from a substantial reduction in their sentences in the corresponding appeal case. The judicial prefatory notes to one of the offender's appellate record speaks volume in this regard. I quote, "The events precipitating the conviction of this accused were set against the background of a guerrilla-type war waged against an unseen, frequently unknown enemy. Against this background and experience, we, meaning the Board of Review, are aware of and consider with great sympathy the feeling of a single Marine who has lost a body by reason of such treachery. The battlefield is not a debating ground, it is singularly a place for action," unquote. The institutionalized rejection of the law of war could not have been formulated more clearly. But such bogus arguments, ladies and gentlemen, have also been seized upon by the home front, as evidenced by its politicians, and injected into the well-worn narrative of American exceptionalism. The image of the dutiful patriot, of the brave jungle fighter, who can only defeat the enemy by fighting him with his own ruthlessness and lawlessness, caught on in large sections of American civil society. Anyone who was willing to take off the kid gloves in the face of such an enemy had the loyalty of conservative veterans associations and politicians alike. The latter increasingly influenced military jurisprudence and thus succeeded in ensuring that many war tribunals were not convened at all, or that convicted perpetrators were sentenced to unusually lenient sentences. As a result, soldiers in the field increasingly interpreted acts of violence against prisoners as trivial offenses. For the suffering of others was of no interest either in Vietnam or in broad sections of American society. Empathy with the enemy was rare. Only the peace movement took up critical media reports. Nevertheless, no window of opportunity manifested itself at the political level to remedy the institutionalized abuses in the treatment of communist prisoners. It is quite possible that this involved a social self-protection already diagnosed by psychologist Robert J. Lifton. The uncomfortable transgression of civilizational precepts by one's own boys on the oh-so-distant imperial periphery, after all, did not fit well into the well-worn master narrative of America virtuously winning its just wars, as George Washington once did against George III. To a certain extent, the winter soldiers mentioned at the beginning of this presentation also fit into these pictures, since they sought throughout their lives to strengthen opposition to military tribunals and to exonerate alleged war criminals as victims of the system. In contrast, they themselves were always the purified ones who claimed civic obedience and loyalty to America. The fact that many of them had themselves been guilty of the worst war crimes could almost be forgotten in view of their public apology speeches. In a society where 20 veterans still kill themselves every day, a topical question seems relevant to me, which I would like to formulate as an outlook. Could it be that witnessing or committing war crimes leads to an increased incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder? If so, the excessive violence of the war waged in Southeast Asia would have reverberated in much broader ways on the warring societies than contemporaries intended. In this sense, there is no lack of research desiderata for future projects. For the analysis and interpretation of the inside view of war in particular reveals an enormous variety of contradictory stories of human behavior. Behavior that usually has little to do with heroism or idealism, but much more with a pragmatic adaptation to perceived realities. Consequently, violence against enemy prisoners can rarely be explained in monocausal terms. And we should be wary of seeking simple answers to highly complex questions. This concluding statement is not intended to excuse the perpetrators who have had their say in this presentation, but certainly to serve as a guide to understanding what acts normal people are capable of in extreme situations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berney. I would ask the audience to refrain from any questions right now. We'll take questions after the second presentation, but I'm sure we'll have a really good discussion on that fine paper. Now, please, Dr. Behringer.
Well, first I would like to thank Professor De Leonardis, Dr. Pascalito, Dr. Rao, Professor Hoffenar, and the members of the selection committee for awarding my dissertation the Covissier Prize. Thank you also to General Rachmanidis and the organizing committee for hosting the conference and giving us all an opportunity to see Greece in such style. And I want to also thank my dissertation committee, especially my advisor, Max Paul Friedman, and my family for their unflagging support. The Fulbright program, American Council's Title VIII funding, and American University provided funding that allowed me to spend nearly a year conducting research in the Russian archives in Moscow and Vladivostok, in addition to various shorter trips around the United States, Tokyo, and London. Before I begin my talk, I wanted to provide a couple of maps to help orient everyone and to define the Middle East. Or it's not the Middle East, the Russian Far East. So, let's see, if this has a pointer, I guess not. But you can see the territory I've highlighted or I put a border around in red is what I would call the Russian Far East. East of Lake Baikal, in this case, cutting through Manchuria on the Chinese Eastern Railway, and then around Sakhalin and Primorsky Krai, where Russia kind of comes down there. And this slide shows the various branches of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and we're going to be focusing on of course, the part on the right here, and Chita, Khabarovsk, Harbin, and Vladivostok all play prominent roles in this story. In the summer of 1918, when US President Woodrow Wilson finally agreed to intervene in the Russian Civil War, he invited Japan to cooperate in a joint expedition. And he envisioned a light military footprint to facilitate an economic and humanitarian mission that would prevent Russia from disintegrating. According to the deal, the United States and Japan would send around 7,000 soldiers. But the Japanese military, arguing that their special interests on the Asian continent were threatened, disregarded the troop limit and poured in 10 times as many troops. At its high point in October 1918, the Japanese expedition exceeded 70,000 troops, and the American contingent never reached 9,000. The fact that Japan sent nearly 10 times as many soldiers to the Russian Far East has not led American historians to explore the Japanese role in much detail. English language histories of the intervention focus overwhelmingly on US policymakers and the US military, and there's only 2 English language monographs dedicated to the Japanese expedition, one of them written in the 1950s. But the size disparity was reflected in the local Soviet memory of the intervention. In the 1950s and 60s, when the Soviet government sought to commemorate the 40th and 50th anniversaries of the October Revolution, it encouraged citizens to write down their recollections and submit them for archival safekeeping. Written at or near the height of the Cold War, one would expect these memoirs to focus on the US imperialist assault on the fledgling Soviet state. Except for brief ideological introductions or asides that lumped Japanese and Americans together, however, these recollections hardly mentioned the United States at all. In contrast, these memoirs focused overwhelmingly on the damage inflicted by Japanese troops and by their support for anti-Bolshevik forces. Now, there's little doubt that the foreign intervention in the Russian Civil War fueled the Bolsheviks' sense of encirclement and harmed attempts to foster constructive relations between them and the Allies. The Soviets would use the fact that US troops helped occupy Russian territory as a rhetorical cudgel in arguing that the Americans were to blame for starting the Cold War. But given the quarter century that passed between the end of the US intervention and the onset of the Cold War, one can hardly make the claim that the ambiguous American reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution caused the Cold War, or even that it played anything more than that of a minor irritant in US-Soviet relations. The intervention thus presents a relatively small data point on the path to Cold War, and one could very easily imagine US-Soviet relations quickly growing frosty in 1945 without it. Focusing instead on the intervention in the Russian Far East as a local and regional contest among the Red Army soldiers, partisans, peasants, workers, Imperial Russian officers, ethnic minorities and diaspora, Japanese and Americans, brings to the fore other, more immediate consequences. That the Bolsheviks would emerge from the Russian Civil War victorious was not a foregone conclusion. That they would be able to reconstitute Russia's imperial borders in the Far East was improbable, and this is partly the story of how and why they did. Although American soldiers took part in some of the fighting and committed some atrocities, they were largely bystanders, and the most important roles they played were as witnesses and record keepers. And what they saw, or what they thought they saw, had a profound effect on US-Soviet-Japanese relations. In the end, US officials fell back on explanations that fit into their suspicions that Russians, whether Bolshevik or anti-Bolshevik, and Japanese, were uncivilized, prone to committing atrocities, and unworthy of American assistance and cooperation. I organized the dissertation into 3 parts. The first 4 chapters cover US-Russian-Japanese relations to 1918. Chapter 1 provides the historical context of this trilateral relationship, focusing on interactions in Northeast Asia up to 1917, as well as the cultural perceptions of Americans, Russians, and Japanese toward one another. The chapter demonstrates how the United States became estranged from both Russia and Japan and pushed the 2 former opponents closer toward each other in the decade following the Russo-Japanese War. This slide by a Russian editorial cartoonist, with its racist depiction of Japan as a monkey, pokes fun at President Theodore Roosevelt for supposedly facilitating the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War, in which the piece of fruit with Port Arthur labeled on it ends up falling on Roosevelt's head. The irony is that by the time this cartoon appeared, Russia and Japan were already well on their way to becoming allies. And there's a counterfactual lurking in this chapter that throws the significance of the US, Russia, and Japan triangle into sharp relief. Perhaps if the United States had done more to cultivate strategic relations with Russia after 1900, in service of balancing the rise of Japan, some of the violence that enveloped East Asia between 1914 and 1945 might have been avoided. Chapter 2 discusses the US reaction to Russia's February Revolution, arguing that it had a major impact on Woodrow Wilson's decision to take the United States to war in Europe against Germany. This chapter also highlights the role of the US railway mission sent to the Russian Far East as a way of holding Russia together and keeping it in the war. By encouraging Russia to continue fighting on the Eastern Front, the United States played a role in the demise of the provisional government. At the same time, the railway mission acted as a lever, pulling the Wilson administration toward involvement in the Russian Civil War. This slide shows the head of the railway mission, John F. Stevens, posing with one of his subordinates. And the man on the left is not a military officer, but a member of the Russian Railway Service Corps. Chapter 3 describes how the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War developed in the Russian Far East. It introduces 2 of the most important figures in the narrative. On the anti-Bolshevik side, this was Grigory Semyonov, a Cossack captain with close ties to the Japanese who eventually created his own government in Chita in Transbaikal. And on the Bolshevik side, I described the rise of Alexander Krasnoshokov, an exiled revolutionary who came to the Russian Far East after over a decade in the United States. Now, after Semyonov's fall in Chita, Krasnoshokov would become a leader in the Far Eastern Republic, a quasi-independent buffer state that proved instrumental to diplomatic negotiations with Japan, which I'll get to in a moment. The chapter also narrates the battle for Blagoveshchensk in March 1918, an important, though somewhat overlooked event in the history of the Civil War. This detailed map, I was hoping to have a laser pointer, but there it is. Let's see, here's Harbin. Blagoveshchensk is right here. I just wanted to put that on the map. And here's Transbaikal and Chita, Vladivostok, Khabarovsk again. And this is a picture of the Japanese volunteers in Blagoveshchensk, which was the first major clash to feature Japanese citizens in combat roles, and in which white forces successfully overturned red authority. However, the anti-Bolsheviks' victory was only temporary, and their eventual loss illustrates both their persistent strategic mistakes and their opponents' structural advantages. Chapter 4 provides a close re-examination of Wilson's decision to invite the Japanese on a joint intervention. And Wilson's decision, by the way, has created the largest historiographical debate in the field. And I tried to put forward a new argument. So the chapter begins by detailing the intelligence coming out of the Russian Far East, demonstrating that if Wilson had been intent on overthrowing the Bolsheviks, he would have faced almost no resistance from his military and consular officials reporting on the situation. The chapter argues that it was only after the Bolsheviks lost their authority in the Russian Far East that Wilson decided to act. He arrived at this conclusion after Moscow and Berlin signed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, which ceded vast amounts of Russian territory to Germany and took Russia out of World War I. But even then, Wilson waited 4 more months before opting to send in the troops. And the catalytic event was the Czechoslovak Legion's seizure of the Trans-Siberian Railway, beginning in May and concluding with their overthrow of Soviet authority in Vladivostok in late June. The Bolsheviks having lost control of the situation, Wilson concluded that the military intervention was required to keep Russia from breaking apart and becoming more vulnerable to German domination. In the Czechoslovaks, he thought he saw a path to reunite Russia. Ironically, however, it was Wilson's invitation that broke the deadlock within the Japanese government, tipping the balance in favor of those advocating a large and forceful expedition. And here you can see a selection from his aide-memoire, which is the only public policy pronouncement explaining why he chose to intervene, which highlights none of the government's inaction contemplates any impairment of her territorial integrity either now or hereafter. So I would like to put forward that the territorial integrity of Russia was foremost on Wilson's mind, and also spans not only the initial decision to intervene, but the decision to stay involved after the end of World War I. Now, part 2, consisting of chapters 5 and 6, examines the period of joint U.S. and Japanese intervention from the summer of 1918 to the spring of 1920. Chapter 5 narrates the military and political developments of this period. Almost as soon as American boots landed on the docks of Vladivostok, it became apparent that the various groups of anti-Bolsheviks did not offer a viable alternative to Moscow, and that the Japanese army had no intention of maintaining a limited and neutral presence. Instead of supporting a reunification of Russia under a non-Bolshevik regime, the U.S. Army's primary task became guarding the railway in order to prevent dismemberment by the Japanese military. In the first half of 1919, the anti-Bolsheviks threw the Red Army back into European Russia. However, U.S. support for the government of Admiral Kolchak, who claimed the title of Supreme Ruler of Russia and nominally controlled territory from Omsk to Vladivostok, was slow and tepid, despite the rising tide of anti-communism at home with the Red Scare going on. The inability of Kolchak to demonstrate that he could rein in and unify his commanders in the Far East hampered his ability to procure U.S. support. Instead, the Americans watched as the Red Army rolled all the way east to Irkutsk, and Washington decided in December 1919 to pull the plug. Rather than insisting that their Japanese counterparts assume the burden, U.S. officials called for Tokyo to follow their lead and leave. This abrupt decision shocked Japanese policymakers who coalesced around a strategy of partial withdrawal and retrenchment. And in April 1920, the last U.S. troops left Vladivostok. The Japanese assumed that, that their argument that they were kind of the last line against the spread of communism would be a more convincing argument to support their mission. Chapter 6 analyzes the U.S. military experience of the Russian Civil War. And going into the intervention, Americans were unprepared for the scale and character of the violence they witnessed, particularly that perpetrated by their purported allies, the anti-Bolsheviks and the Japanese. Part of the reason for this was that the primary source of military intelligence was Major David Prescott Barrows, an ardent anti-communist who emphasized Bolshevik atrocities but downplayed those of Semyonov and other Bolshevik leaders. And he was a particular admirer of Semyonov and also a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and a veteran of the war in the Philippines. The chapter contrasts Barrows' approach with that of his successor, Major Robert L. Eichelberger, who viewed anti-Bolshevik policies as driving peasants to support the communists. The American commander, General William S. Graves, saw documenting anti-Bolshevik and Japanese atrocities as one of the American Expeditionary Force's main tasks. Witnessing this violence played a major role in convincing American officials that Russians of all stripes were backward, uncivilized, not ready for self-government, and undeserving of U.S. efforts to prevent a Bolshevik takeover. Instead, the United States implemented and stuck to a policy of non-recognition toward Moscow. Observing Japanese behavior toward the local population also played a role in solidifying stereotypes of the Japanese as savage, brutal, and duplicitous. These negative stereotypes, these negative perceptions played a major role in cementing myths about the Japanese character that were used to justify a war without mercy, to take John Dower's famous phrase, after 1941. In addition, the chapter examines the difference between Bolshevik and anti-Bolshevik strategies of violence in the Russian Civil War in the Far East. Based on local Russian archival evidence, the chapter finds that whereas the Bolsheviks focused on attacking state infrastructure, their opponents deployed a population-centric approach aimed at rooting out ideological enemies. This anti-Bolshevik propaganda poster on the slide illustrates the point. It not only links the anti-Bolshevik forces to Japan, but it also portrays Bolshevism as a scythe-wielding skeleton sowing fire in its wake, an inferno that threatens to spread into Siberia. The chapter argues that the difference between these two strategies helps explain why the anti-Bolsheviks appeared to use violence more indiscriminately and ineffectively in the Far East, and also why they were unable to construct their own viable state. And one of the points that I try to emphasize is that in the historiography, it's often been mentioned that the Bolsheviks were better state builders than the anti-Bolsheviks. When we look at the documents, it's not that the anti-Bolsheviks didn't try to build a state, but it's more that in my view, that the Bolsheviks were state destroyers before they were state builders, and that they were very focused on attacking state infrastructure and ripping down any semblance of a state. The final part of the dissertation focuses on the period of Japanese occupation from April 1920 to October 1922. Chapter 7 centers on 3 massacres in the pivotal year of 1920. First, in the Nikolaevsk massacre, which played out from March until June 1920, a group of Red-affiliated partisans captured the town and executed the entire Japanese population, about 700 Japanese, and about half of the Russian residents, probably 5,000 people. Meanwhile, the Japanese military launched an offensive on April 4th and 5th, 1920, to consolidate control over the maritime territory, killing hundreds of Koreans and abusing the local population, the Russian local population as well. And then finally, in the Hunchun massacre in the fall of 1920, the Japanese military used a bandit attack on Japanese residents in the Manchurian town as an excuse for a long and bloody campaign against the Korean population in Manchuria. Now I will go back to this map here. Hunchun is located somewhere in this area. So right across the border from Russia, and it was a Korean town in Manchuria, and also, so the border between Russia and Manchuria at the time was quite porous, and the Koreans living on both sides of the border would go back and forth. These violent incidents demonstrate the ways in which, on all sides, criminality and banditry became entangled with ideology and ethnicity. They also show how the Japanese military used the intervention in Russia as a pretext for trying to protect and expand its imperial control over the broader Korean population. From a political standpoint, these massacres were important because they increased the pressure on the Japanese government to remain in the Far East, even though most of its civilian leadership favored withdrawal. Chapter 8 explores the diplomacy of the intervention's final phase from 1920 to 1922. It analyzes the creation of the Far Eastern Republic as a buffer state strategy to facilitate Japanese withdrawal. Although widely viewed as a Soviet puppet, the chapter argues that local actors sought autonomy and focused on building a real state, both of which facilitated the Soviets' attempts to increase U.S. diplomatic pressure on Japan to withdraw. Through its railway mission in Harbin, the United States was able to procure secret information which improved Washington's ability to play to the strengths of Japanese officials who favored exiting Russia, culminating in the Washington Conference of 1921 to 1922. You've probably heard the story about the conference and the role of Herbert, now I'm going to forget his name. The story about how they cracked the code of the Japanese diplomatic correspondence and found out that they would be willing to sign a deal on the 5-5-3 ratio for the ships. But in this case, this correspondence was actually intercepted in the Far East. Translations of the Japanese correspondence into Russian and then translated into English. And then what I argue is that these documents proved much more pivotal than the other cracked codes that you hear about, because the agreements that were signed as a result of this intelligence led to kind of the establishment of the order in East Asia in the 1920s. U.S. policy toward the Far Eastern Republic and Japan shows that the Harding administration was as committed as its predecessor to supporting a unified Russia rather than allowing Japan to form its own breakaway buffer state. The success of the Far Eastern Republic helps to explain how the Bolsheviks were able to win the Civil War and reconstitute the Russian Empire, and why the anti-Bolsheviks failed in their attempts to build their own states. And in an epilogue, I track the fates of the various major characters in this history in order to illustrate the Russian Civil War's impact on trilateral US-Soviet-Japanese relations, Northeast Asia, and Japan's resurgent imperial expansion and militarism in the 1930s. This section serves as a reminder that the intervention's significance lies less in creating the conditions for the eventual Cold War than in laying the groundwork for the conflagration of the Pacific Theater in World War II. I'm honored to accept this award, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berenger, for that very enlightening presentation on a series of events in a part of the world which, quite frankly, I knew very little until I read your dissertation, particularly the implications for later conflict in the Far East involving the United States and other players. We have some time for questions. We're allowed only 1 hour for this session. So I open up to the floor. I mean, I think most of us know each other, so I'm kind of going to dispense with the rule you identify. I would ask you to stand. I don't think it's necessary to identify yourself unless you are some person unknown, and ask your questions. Though, as Pete said this morning, I would ask you to refrain from giving lectures. Please ask questions. Who would like to go first? Yes, please stand.
Peter Lieb from the German Commission. Thanks a lot to both of you for your papers. I have some questions or critical comments on the paper that Mr. Berni or Dr. Berni gave us. I think your analysis to me looked a bit like in a vacuum. It was a bit more or less the master narrative. Nasty Americans, innocent communists, innocent Vietnamese. I think, as we know from Clausewitz, every war violence is reciprocal. And I think you should address, or perhaps you can address now here in these questions, to my questions, how did actually the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese army fight? Was it really brutal? Was it not? How did they treat American prisoners? How did they treat prisoners of the RAVN? How did they treat civilian population? And on top of that, how was this conveyed? How were these messages, these stories conveyed within the US forces? So in my opinion, it needs to be more contextualized, your findings, in order to come to a fully convincing conclusion. And another question would be, was the treatment that you described or analyzed, was it universal? Was it the exception? Was it the rule? Were there any units that were more prone to committing crimes than others? I mean, we have from the studies on the Second World War and atrocities, we know a lot about these questions. I've tried to answer them, and I would like to ask you whether you can give me some answers to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. It's a very important question, and I never set out to evade this question. So I would definitely refer you to my book, where I clearly state that the other side, meaning the communists, the North Vietnamese, regulars, but also the irregulars, fought a war of terror, a very, very brutal war, and they didn't even care about the Geneva Conventions because they never signed them. So the moral self, how do I say this? The moral self-conviction of the Americans is another one than the one of the opposing side. So I would definitely say it's a dynamic of violence that's at play here. You have definitely seen all the pictures of the American prisoners in the North, the so-called famous Hanoi Hilton, where they're openly tortured, where they're openly abused, and all these stories. But that is familiar. We are aware of this. You can read it in the literature. It's nothing new. I mean, I would refer to the works of Douglas Pike, for example. The challenge for a history PhD these days is to add something new. And it seemed very striking to me that we didn't have any account of the other side. So how the American treated their prisoners, and not only the Americans. I go way into also the South Vietnamese treatment of prisoners and the treatment of other Allied soldiers. So this is in no way to excuse the other side or to say that communists or North Vietnamese were the holy soldiers and the Americans were bad. I never wanted to draw up this narrative, but it was not the Fragestellung in this regard, so that's why this focus. Then the other question is very interesting. It is very, very hard, and you must know this better than me, to generalize. You have some sort of units that are prone to violence and others that are very, very abstaining. So I think in the case of Vietnam, you have the 2 Marine divisions who are up in the north. Then you have the 4th Infantry, the 23rd Infantry. So here we should go into unit history. How are they composed? How are the soldiers, how have they been put together, and how have these units developed? And then I would go on and say we should study some sort of organizational culture and also divisional cultures, probably, in order to understand this better. But I could not do this in the form of this dissertation. This would have been a whole other thing to do, yeah.
Yes, Alan. Yeah.
First of all, Paul, Dr. Berenger, I think you meant Yardley, the American Yardley, right? The
That's
one,
right,
the
yes,
cryptologist.
yes, Herbert Yardley.
Fascinating story, but no. And to your fascinating presentation, a question. Throughout history, striking terror was a very effective tool of preventing enemy from fighting you. I mean, you as a Swiss would know, the Swiss mercenaries in the late Middle Ages did not take prisoners. And during the fight against, let's say, Burgundy, the Burgundia, especially at Battle of Nancy, they did not take prisoners. And quite often, enemy soldiers would run away, meeting the Swiss. I'd rather run away now instead of being killed by them. The question is whether this was a part of dissuading civilians from joining Charlie, from joining the VC. Oh, well, if I join them, the Americans will get rid of me. You know, so the question, was it any part of, even without announcing it officially, some sort of striking terror in the heart of an enemy or presumed enemy or possible enemy? Thank you.
That is a very fascinating question, and I want to address this in future projects. It is essentially what I call strategic violence. So the use of excessive violence in order to non-verbally communicate to the enemy, but also to the non-combatants and to people from outside. So I would connect this with a sort of term that has come up in the recent research on violence, which is exemplary violence. So you punish one or two in front of others, or you torture the father in front of his family in order to show that this is what might happen if you even consider to joining the other side. But here it strikes me that we don't have any, or at least I'm not aware of any comparative studies. So I think that this would add a flavor that is quite very interesting, very sad obviously, but very interesting to study, where we could also meld history with psychology, sociology, and different disciplines, and would make up for a very interesting comparison, so to speak. But I would definitely say you're onto something, and this exemplary strategic dimension is something that we should always consider when we look at isolated or sort of isolated massacres, torture events, excessive violence in all there.
Not necessarily the other side. Look at the Kimatio.
Yeah.
Your own side.
Absolutely.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Massimo.
Thank you. Well, my question is about a long-term perspective. I mean, as an Italian, it's to Dr. Berni. As an Italian, I am perfectly aware, of course, that there were cases of atrocities against Italian prisoners of war in Sicily in 1943. So my question is, there is something maybe, so this Vietnam is something which is not entirely new in much greater numbers. So I wonder if I don't know enough the situation of the guerrilla in the Philippines at the beginning of the century, when the Philippines reacted against the Americans. So frankly speaking, I don't know exactly. But my question is that why, I am really, being a friend of America, I am really shocked when I hear these narratives, and I wonder which is the rationale, the deep instinct. Maybe I identify two, because the Americans tend to consider themselves really the embodiment of what is good or what is right, and the enemy is by definition evil. So the Italian soldiers were fascists, were evil. The communist guerrilla in Vietnam were communists, so were evil. I don't know if my comment finds some reaction from you.
It is quite interesting what you're talking about, because the Americans at the beginning of the war, they go one step further, and there's a big debate at this time, should we apply full Geneva protection to enemy prisoners? Because you could legitimately argue, no, they're irregular soldiers, so they're not allowed to be treated as prisoners of war because they never have signed the Geneva Conventions, they don't use them in their fighting forces. And so there are voices in the American Armed Forces, but also from the judicial branches that say GC3, the Third Geneva Convention of 1949, does not apply to enemy prisoners because they're not part of a standing army. And there are 3 criteria that you have to employ in order to be considered as POW. I don't have to repeat all this now, but then there is an interesting thing that happens. So inside the American Armed Forces, you have a lot of colonels and even higher generals who say, no, we owe it to the world, we are kind of the good guys, on ethical and moral grounds to treat everyone as POW and to give them the broad rights of enemy prisoners. This is based on, I would say, 3 reasons. First of all, we have the ethical and moral arguments. Second, also a fear of reprisal. I mean, journalists are active here, the media is there, then also civilians are there, and we are afraid that if we treat the enemy badly, he will, of course, do the same with our pilots that are shot down in North Vietnam. And thirdly, an argument that is quite frequently also in the sources is that the reputation. So we as Americans, we are the good guys, we cannot let this happen, and the opposition to the war might grow stronger in the US, but also outside in other countries, which is what exactly happened at the end of the war. And so I would definitely give you, or agree with you 100%, at least at the beginning, this moral argument is very strong and is very nicely seen in this POW issue.
Yes, Adam.
Thank you to both of you for 2 very interesting presentations. I have a question for Marcel. Marcel, would you be able to bring out for us a little bit further the implications of what you were saying about the effect that orders to search and destroy had on American soldiers? I mean, I think we all know that the objective to destroy the enemy army is, of course, a very frequent military objective. But I mean, certainly Isabel Hull has put forward the thesis, which I don't entirely agree with necessarily, that the German army's doctrine of the battle of annihilation at the beginning of the 20th century encouraged it toward the commission of war crimes because there is such a focus on annihilation. But what exactly is the link between generals ordering their army to destroy the enemy army and the commission of war crimes?
So first of all, this is not a regular war at all. It is an irregular guerrilla type of war. The Americans have a big problem in defining the center of gravity, in Clausewitz's words. So what is the point that tells me when I'm winning or when I'm losing? You have no Napoleonic-style battles here. You have small skirmishes that are mostly dictated by the enemy. And you don't take any hills, or you take hills, but you leave them as American or Allied troops, but you have no sense of progress. So there's a desperate attempt to come up with new metrics, and one of them is the body count, kill ratio, search and destroy. So very, very martialistic and bellicose things in order to make any sort of progress in this war without traditional front lines. And if you talk about body count, where the only number that interests at the end of the day is the number of enemy dead, then it leads to an atmosphere where prisoners are not treated the way they should be, because the only thing that counts is the number of deaths. And that's why I wanted to show the video, because I think there we have it in a very short and graphic way, the effects of this very wrong way of incentives, because soldiers were paid or were rewarded when they produced enemy deaths. And in one instance, one battalion even goes to a cemetery and tries to go to the grave and unearth dead bodies in order to have any sort of bodies. And obviously this is so obscene and so un-American and not even humanly. But still, the point is to produce bodies, and this is not only a military incentive. It comes right from the Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara, who demands a crossover point, which is the point when the North cannot field any more troops because basically all of them are dead. And this is, in hindsight, this was one of the cardinal mistakes that was employed, and that had some repercussions also in the treatment of enemy POWs or captives.
Yes, Michael?
Same question for... Thank you very much. Same question for both speakers. What, at the end, is the relevance of the fact that the opponent side on these two theaters of war were considered as communists or Bolshevists? What kind of relevance had that on the ground for the American soldiers in these two completely different conflicts? You, Marcel, I mean, you have it in the title, communist prisoners. But when I listened to this pilot, to this man in the film, I think he was mainly speaking about Vietnamese or Asians. He never mentioned the word communist. And in the same direction for you, Mr. Behringer, there were these newspapers about the horrification of Bolshevism and everything. But at the end, on the ground there for the single American shows, he had to do with Russians or with other peoples who were there. How relevant was this communist or Bolshevist aspect? Thank you.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. What I argue in the paper is that, or in the dissertation, is that the Americans saw the violence perpetrated by the anti-Bolsheviks against the local Russian population and were horrified by this, and because the Bolsheviks had already lost power by the time the Americans come in, there weren't actually that many communists around at the beginning of the intervention. And so the Americans didn't actually witness any communist perpetrated atrocities. There's rumors of things going on in Siberia, in Western Siberia and European Russia, but what they're witnessing is atrocities committed by anti-Bolsheviks and Japanese. And so then when the partisan forces come back in 1919, the Americans explain it as, well, these aren't real Bolsheviks, these are the anti-Bolsheviks. The whites push them toward the Bolshevik side. So, so that's how they kind of rationalize it, I guess. And it's also somewhat surprising that they don't sympathize with the whites or the Japanese in this regard, because obviously the whites and the Japanese are saying, look, we're fighting communists, we're fighting Bolshevism, but it just carries very little weight. I would say on the Japanese side now, the Japanese are very active in painting their opponents as communists, and but the real focus of their actions is often directed against Koreans, and so being Korean bleeds into being a communist. All Koreans are communists, and so we're fighting against the Koreans as a form of combating communism.
Unfortunately, we are scheduled to go elsewhere at 17:30. I feel bad at cutting this off now because I got two individuals at the back with arms raised like the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. But I would encourage you to approach our speakers over drinks at our next venue and carry on this very fascinating discussion we've had. I only wish we could go on longer, but I'd like to have a round of applause for our two very brilliant presentations.